You must unlearn what you have learned.
All right, I'll give it a try.
No, try not. Do or do not. There is no try.
Today, let's build an app that turns any text into Yoda speech. So we write here in Xcode, and this is just a usual example application. Of course, I added a Yoda image, which is just an asset here in our asset catalog, just an image that I grabbed from Google. Doesn't really matter which one you use here. Not that important, but what is important is the Fun Translations API, which is completely free to use and actually has a Yoda endpoint, which we can use to turn any strings into Yoda speech. So it is fairly easy to use. All we have to do is grab this URL here and then add a text parameter to that URL with the string that we want to translate or to Yodafy, basically. So in the end, it would look something like this over here. So for that, let's first of all add the URL. So let's say let base URL be the string that we just copied, and then we can already add the question mark text equals for our string parameter that we're going to add next. So for the text, we probably want to have a text field and probably want to bind the text field to a string. So let's just create a private state variable here, and let's just call this text. Will be of type string, and it will be an empty string in the beginning. In case you're wondering how I did that, this is just an Xcode shortcut that I have set up. You can learn more about Xcode shortcuts in this video up here. I'm using Bakery here. It's a macOS app to create app icons. Let's select one of these gradients for the background and perhaps use the frog emoji. Yeah, this looks good already, but actually let's use an image of Yoda instead. Yeah, that's better. So let's just drag it to the asset catalog in Xcode. Check out this video sponsor, Bakery, with the link in the video description. Alright, so let's now add a text field instead of this hello world string down here. So let's say text field. The title key should be just, or let's say input text. And then we can bind to our state variable. And I also want this to grow vertically in case we run out of space. So then we can also add a text field style here, so it's a bit more visible, and I will just go with a rounded border, not the fanciest style, but it works for now. And then what we can also do is add a line limit, and let's say it should be 4 lines, and we want to reserve space. So, all right, so now we have this nice text field over here. And next, let's add a .onSubmit view modifier here, so we can actually call the API when the user presses the enter key in the text field. We will be using Swift concurrency here, so async await, which means that we will have to create a task first. Alright, so let's first of all construct our URL, then we will send the URL request, get back a JSON response, which we will also have to implement in a second, and then somehow display that response to the user as the new Yodafied text, basically. So let me quickly write that out as comments so it's easier for us to implement it in a second. All right, so let's start by creating the full URL. So the first thing we have to do is actually URL encode our text parameter. So we will say let encoded text equals our text dot adding %encoding with allowed characters. And here we can say URL path allowed. I believe this is the one that we will need. And then we can add this to our URL. So we can say let full URL string is our base URL plus our encoded text. And this unfortunately is optional. So as a fallback, and let's actually add this up here, let's say hello %20 there. Okay, and then we will of course need to actually construct a URL object. So guard let URL equals a URL from a string, and the string of course is our full URL string, and if that fails we will just bail out of this task and not do anything basically, but usually this should not be an issue. Okay, so now let's send a URL request and get back the response. So we will say let data, and we don't care about the URL response object here, so I'll just use the underscore notation, equals try await URL session. We will use the shared URL session dot data from our URL. And we can have a look here. This data object is really of type data. So what we now want is to decode something from this using a JSON decoder basically. But for that we need to know how the response looks, and let's have a look at the response. So let's just grab that, go back to Xcode, and then let's just add a comment down here and actually build a response object. So let's create a struct and let's call it YodaResponse. This has to be decodable. We could make this codable as well, but since we don't ever want to actually encode this data in this app, it's sufficient to make it decodable. So this has a contents object and a success object. So let success be of type success, and let's define that as well. So success also has to be decodable, and it will have a total which is an integer. So we got that, and then we have a let contents be of type contents, and let's define the contents struct. Let's also make that decodable, and in here we will have a translated string, and we will have a text which is the original text that we fed into the API. Okay, so now we can decode our JSON as this Yoda response. So let's say let response equals try JSON decoder dot decode our Yoda response dot self from the data. And then in the end, we probably want to have another state variable that we can use to assign this response to. So let's say translated text should be an optional string, because in the beginning we don't have any translated text yet. And then perhaps above the Yoda image, we can say if let translated text and unwrap it like this. So now this is not optional anymore. And then we can add a text element with that string up there. And then of course down here we still have to say translated text equals our response, which doesn't work of course because the response is a Yoda response, and all we really care about is response.contents.translated. So let's run this now in the simulator and see if it works. Alright, so the app has now loaded in our simulator. So let's input some text. Do you judge me by my size? ? And now we can hit enter. And we get back the response, you judge me by my size, do? Not exactly the quote from the movies, but close enough. So in this video you learned about the free Fun Translations API and that it has a Yoda endpoint. You also learned about how you can add line limits or like describe the size of a text field. You also learned about how you can encode text so you can use it as the path parameter of a URL. And then you of course used URLSession and JSON decoder to actually get back data from the API and display it in your app. May the force be with you.